Well, I was puzzled when I was asked to do this, and then realised actually that all the groups I talked to, they're basically concerned with the same things, the same issues to do with discrimination and anxiety and worries about how we're seen and judged. And I basically want to show how that all gets worse with bigger income differences between rich and poor. The more the society is polarised, the more we look down on any vulnerable group, whether they're disabled, whether they're, I don't know, any group who is regarded as lower social status, I suppose, or is more vulnerable. So racial prejudices go up. Women's pay disadvantage goes up with bigger income differences. So I want to sort of show how you're part of a much bigger process in our society. I'm often appalled by how every now and then we get new studies of levels of anxiety and stress in the population as a whole. And it's something like 74% of the British population say that they're often overwhelmed and unable to cope with the levels of stress. Americans, a similar proportion of the population say they're paralyzed by stress. And something like a third of the population have suicidal thoughts and things like that. But what's so bizarre is that the media, when these reports come out and they have a little article on it and so on, they say we must have more services. Of course services are valuable, but we've got to ask what makes our society like this. When we're living in sort of unparalleled levels of at least physical comfort, these, what I suppose one might see as social discomforts, are so powerful. Why do we live in a society which has such high levels of prejudice, discrimination, lack of empathy, and so on? And so that's really what I'm wanting to talk about, and why inequality, bigger inequalities, make that all worse. So I will be talking a lot about income inequality, but I want you to understand that I don't just mean more poverty. I sometimes want people to think of income inequality as changing social relationships. It puts us in a sort of hierarchy. It increases the idea that some people are better than others. All those kinds of conceptions, and with that goes increasing worries about how others see and judge us. Do they see you as a failure, incapable, unattractive, boring, whatever it is? And now we can show this in the data. And I've spent my career not actually talking to people, which is the most valuable process, but sitting in front of a computer. So I'm going to show you quite a lot of statistics. But I think the value of that is that I think on all sorts of issues, people feel, okay, these are my intuitions, this is what I think is true, but actually to be able to demonstrate it in hard data, so it's publicly recognizable, so people can't just say, well, I disagree with you. You can't be dismissed when there's hard data that shows these processes. So, I want to make it so I can see this better. And when I'm talking about income differences, I'm really talking, I think, about whether our society is a very steep social hierarchy like that, a social pyramid, or a much shallower one. And basically, the bigger the material differences are between us, income and wealth, the bigger the social distances. the bigger those feelings of superiority and inferiority, and our fears to do with that. I want to read you a study. You might think it's 100 miles, well, actually thousands of miles from what you're talking about and concerned about often here. It comes from a study where they interviewed people in poverty in both rich and poor countries. So they interviewed people in poverty about their experience of poverty in Uganda, India, China, Pakistan, Korea, United Kingdom and Norway. So they had rich countries and poor countries. And what poverty means in those different countries is poles apart. And in Norway, someone counted as poor might live in a 2 or 3 bedroom flat with central heating, most of the modern electronics. Whereas in India, they might be a 1-room shack with no sewerage and so on. But the experience, despite those big material differences, was remarkably similar. Respondents, this paper says, universally despised poverty and frequently despised themselves for being poor. Parents were often despised by their children, women despised their menfolk, and some men were reported to take out their self-loathing on their partners and children. Despite generally believing that they had done their best against all odds, they mostly considered that they had both failed themselves by being poor and that others saw them as failures. This internalization of shame was further externally reinforced in the family, the workplace, and in their dealings with officials. Even children couldn't escape this shaming, for with the possible exception of Pakistan, school was an engine of social grading, a place of humiliation for those without the possessions that guaranteed social acceptance. And you can see already quite a bit of the sort of experiences that LGBT groups feel from their experiences, whether at school or later on. And indeed, I hope I've got the slide in later, which shows huge differences in bullying in schools. Much more bullying in schools in more unequal societies. What we did was simply download the figures on the scale of income differences, how much richer the top 20% in each country than the bottom 20%, and then show how that is related to one thing after another. That actually, the quote I've just read was from this paper, and poverty means that sort of thing in some countries and that sort of thing in some of the richest societies. And yet the experience was about being looked down on, being made to feel inferior, all the anxieties of that kind, that were, as human beings, were highly sensitive to how others see and judge us. That's what we're really dealing with. I normally, the talks I give, I put the slides in a completely different order, and I've reordered them for this, and I'm not quite sure whether it's all going to work, but this shows how deeply embedded in us feelings about status are. So this comes from a study of 17,000 civil servants working in government offices, and these are the grades in the office hierarchy. Number 1 is the most senior civil servants, number 6 the most junior, men and women. Now these are graphs showing differences in fibrinogen. Fibrinogen is a blood clotting factor. I want you to think about monkey hierarchies. When I talk about inequality, I tell people this is more about monkeys than about marks. It's about our sensitivity to social hierarchy, and think about monkey ranking systems. But fibrinogen is higher in the most junior men and the most junior women. That pattern is exactly what you see in monkeys in ranking systems, because of course the ones at the bottom of the hierarchy get bitten. They have to keep out of the way of the dominants. They're frightened of the dominants. They're the weakest, and the dominants are the strongest. And so if they get wounded, they want their blood to clot fast. That's the evolved response to fear. And of course this is one of the many health effects contributing to health inequalities, a stress response higher in the most junior. When I'm going to get closer to the interests people have here in a moment, but when we began to realize how important stress was in health inequalities, we started to wonder, of course, what are the most important causes of stress in our society? And we thought, well, losing your home, losing your job, things like that. But actually, those are very serious stresses, but they don't happen to so many people. All of us worry about how we're seen and judged by others. We all have those kinds of anxieties. And indeed, a study which reviewed, I think, 208 experiments where people had been given stressful things to do while having levels of stress hormones measured. You can measure, for instance, cortisol in saliva or in blood samples. And what they found was this, that the tasks which included what they called social evaluative threat, they say in the paper, threats to self-esteem or social status where others can negatively judge your performance. Those are what really get to us and push up our levels of stress hormones. Other tasks, not nearly such a big reaction. And even when people say, well, I'm not too bothered by these things, even people who felt they were fairly confident had the same, you could see the same thing going on in saliva samples and so on. And you see there are endless experiments now which show how issues to do with social status affect performance of almost any kind of task. You know, when you're feeling nervous or feel somebody's looking over your shoulder, you become more self-conscious. You can't give the attention to what you're doing as you would like. So this is just one example. Kids from high and low castes in India, they were given little pen and paper tests to do. And when they didn't know who was high caste and who was low, they did equally well. But as soon as they knew who the high caste ones were and who the low caste ones, suddenly this great gap opens up. And those experiments have been done on different ethnic groups. I don't know that they've been done with LGBT groups, but anything in the experimental situation that reminds you you're in a group who's often regarded as in some way inferior, people prejudiced against you, think you're less good at this kind of tasks, it affects performance. Even just a little subtle hint in the experimental situation. And so that's true whether you're talking, as I said, about class or ethnicity or various other things. Now, all these things, as I said, get worse with bigger income differences in a society. Basically, bigger income differences make class and status and money more important and make us all less cooperative. And you can see that from the data in this paper. You see along the bottom here, you've got the poorest tenth of the population and all the way through to the richest tenth of the population. And up here you've got status anxiety. That's simply worries about how you're seen and judged. And the top line is the high levels of status anxiety in the most unequal societies. These are OECD countries, I think, i.e. fairly rich countries. And then the much lower levels of status anxiety in this bottom line. The poorer people in all of them have more status anxiety than the richer people, but they're all higher in more unequal societies than in the more unequal societies and in the less unequal societies. So basically all these things about prejudice, discrimination, your worries about how people see and judge you are worse in very unequal societies like Britain or the US, not so bad in some of the more equal countries like the Scandinavian countries, or indeed Japan when we were collecting this data. Now there are two responses. If you're worried about how it's seen and judged, you can either talk yourself up, go in for self-aggrandizement, become narcissistic, try and bring into conversation little signs that you're very successful in some way or went to a particularly good university or something like that. And I've sat through dinner parties in the United States where people were telling little jokes. The justification was that each one of them was a little funny incident that happened, but there's hidden agenda all the time. The jokes actually are an opportunity to say, this happened while I was going up to get my prize for such and such, or while my family were coming back from our long haul holiday the other side of the world at the airport in whatever country it was. And you can see actually that narcissism goes up with, this is American data, the red line is narcissism, the blue line is income inequality. So you can either respond to worries about how you're seen and judged with that kind of bigging yourself up, or you can, on the other hand, feel you're no good, you're looked down on, you lack of confidence, low self-esteem and so on, and you start finding social contact very stressful, so you avoid going to social gatherings, parties, whatever, or try just to go where you think there are groups where you won't feel judged like that. But basically, inequality means that people withdraw from social life. Community life gets weaker. You get more people when they withdraw from social life, get depressed and suicidal and so on. I've got a few quotes. I feel they're probably unnecessary here, but I'll show them from. And I mean to put paranoia in there because I think, and I'm going to show that the range of mental illnesses goes up with more inequality. But someone saying I'm extremely shy around people I don't know very well. I get these voices, I guess you can call them, these thoughts that sound like people I'm around, and they all say bad things about me. Oh, look at her, what a freak, just critiquing me on everything I do. I walk down the street and I feel like everyone is just staring at me, picking me apart with their eyes, talking about me behind my back. I've heard so many people talk about other people behind their back, and I know that they must be talking about me in the same way. Deep down, they want to destroy me. I know they know how to do it. There's so many quotes of that kind from people, and there are a few websites where people share their experiences. And so think of those as two opposite responses, the bigging yourself up or that feeling of inadequacy and failure and so on. I must say, when one of the first talks we gave on our more recent book called The Inner Level, someone afterwards said the talk made a huge difference to them. Just listening, they said they no longer blamed themselves for their anxiety and depression and so on. And the trouble with all these things is people, even people involved in providing therapy or psychiatric services, they think of these things just in individual terms. But we have to be asking, why does our whole society suffer so much of this? Not just the groups of people here, but people who, well, just about every group. Click over those, back again. Yes, so you can see depression is more common in more unequal societies. Basically, we downloaded figures on income inequalities for a bunch of rich countries, and also for the American states. We wanted 2 test beds to see whether the same relationships with inequality that we found internationally hold up in a different test bed, i.e. the 50 American states. So there you're seeing more prejudice in more unequal societies. But I said people also big themselves up. This is the result of interviews in this country, in different countries, where people were asked, how do you think you compare with the average in your country? Do you think you're cleverer than other people? Do you think you're more attractive, more generous? It's a bit like this business of, I think 96% of Americans think they drive better than the average person. This is economic inequality, bigger income differences. In the more unequal countries, people big themselves up. They say, yeah, I am better than the others. It's what psychologists call self-enhancement. The other way you can see people responding to this social evaluative threat, worries about how you're seen and judged, is consumerism. You can actually see that if people live in a more unequal society, they spend more money on status goods. They're more likely to buy one of these expensive cars that, BMWs and Audis and I don't know what else, than people in poor areas. Income for income, you can see that. They also spend more money on buying clothes with the right design and labels and so on. So this competition, all these issues to do with self-presentation are affected. And of course the advertisers know this very well and play on it, play on our weaknesses all the time. They often think that advertising should be banned. And they do winkle away at our vulnerabilities in these ways. Psychologists now have found that a number of what they call personality disorders, I'm not a psychologist, so I don't know quite the things they mean, and mental illnesses get worse, are exacerbated by inequality or triggered initially by issues to do with inequality. Sensitivity to basically dominance and subordination. So apparently there's an area of our brain that they call the dominance behavioral system. Again, you need to think of our evolution from animals that had very hierarchical systems. And they actually went through, saying, a huge number of research papers and found that some conditions are related to feelings of subordination, submissiveness, desire to avoid that. So, some of the most violent people in prison, this comes from an American prison psychiatrist who said that he has yet to see a serious act of violence which was not triggered by people feeling looked down on, humiliated, and so on. When he talked to some very violent man who was endlessly being put in solitary confinement in the American prison system, why on earth do you go on with this that you know is going to have this result? And he said, because every motherfucker on the cell block disrespects me. I've got my pride, that's all I've got left, and they're trying to take it away from me. So, you might feel you're defending yourself against being put down, being disrespected, and so on. You might just accept, I am inferior. You might do the opposite. And as I say, big yourself up. But more mental illness is related to these conditions. And when Sherry Johnson published this paper, she was thinking of all societies as having a very similar hierarchy. And I got in touch and said, no, we think the ones with bigger income differences, the hierarchy is worse. And then we began to find data showing that more unequal societies actually do have more mental illness for the sort of reasons they were talking about. This is earlier data that we got from WHO. This is the percentage of the population with any mental illness. This is income inequality, so you see USA and UK most unequal, having much higher rates than Belgium, Netherlands, Japan, more equal countries. And now there's been much better work on this than we did in the British Medical Journal. This looks a bit technical, but the longer the blue lines are, the stronger the correlation between inequality in the 36 OECD countries and these different conditions. If you take depression, for instance, a high correlation between the amount of depression in a country and the scale of income inequality. Interestingly, suicide and alcoholism very slightly the other way, statistically not significant. And I think that is, we noticed that before this paper came out. I think the reason is that suicide and violence can have similar triggers. Supposing you're sacked from your job or your partner leaves you for somebody else or whatever, do you blame yourself or do you blame them? And violence is more likely to go out against others. You blame other people in more unequal societies. You blame yourself in the more equal ones, leading to a bit more suicide, tiny bit more suicide in the more equal countries, but depression much more common in the more unequal societies. I want to now take you down a step further in our sensitivity to these issues of, people being better or worse than others, and superiority and inferiority, all those nasty issues. In our prehistoric past, 90 or 95% of our existence as human beings, we lived very predominantly in highly egalitarian societies as hunters and gatherers. We didn't have those hierarchies. I always used to think that all those societies were small, but a recent book by David Graeber and I can't remember the first name of the second author, Wengrow, said apparently there were some pretty large hunting and gathering societies. They're not just all tiny bands. But anyway, so our evolutionary past is not dominated by hierarchy. And I think we have the, if you like, the inherited, evolved social strategies, both for egalitarian relationships. We know how to treat other people as equals. We choose our friends from amongst our near equals. We don't put them down. We avoid being superior. But very much the opposite when you get into hierarchies. Now, in my background is trying to understand health inequalities. I'm a social epidemiologist. Epidemiologists study health in populations, not in individual patients or in the laboratory. We add up, how many people who get this cancer have been working with this chemical. You find those relationships by doing statistical studies in the whole population. And we were very surprised when slowly it became clear that social status itself is important. Because all I've been telling you, we didn't know in the 1980s, 1990s. This has come out, and the picture have come together much more recently. And actually what became clear is that social status is damaging to health. The health inequalities you probably all know about, death rates 2 or 3 times as high in lowest social groups compared to the highest. And bigger status differences worsen the health of the whole population. But friendship, in contrast, is highly protective of health. So there are really good studies where they take baseline measurements. How many friends do you have? What's the quality of your relationships with others? And then follow through over the next 10 or 20 years. And you find that people with good friendships, social networks, are highly protected from, and the stresses I've been talking about. The effects add up to more rapid aging. You become more vulnerable to all sorts of different conditions. But these two, all that bad for health and this so protective, and actually friendship it matters at least as much, in the studies marginally more, than whether or not you smoke. It's not a little effect. It's really important. But these two things, they're the opposite ways we can come together as human beings. Social status is about power and coercion, privileged access to resources. We all have the same needs, so we could compete potentially for food, for housing, for sexual partners, for anything under the sun. And friendship, instead of the strongest trying to get the biggest share, friendship is saying, I recognize your need. I'm willing to share. It's cooperation. And we've become so highly attuned to this because always the difference between that and that has been so important throughout our evolution. Getting your social relationships right matters so much. And indeed, it's even now in the language. Words like companion in European languages, it combines con, meaning with, and pan, bread. So your companions or friends are the people who share resources with. Really important. And this man who is such a fine, he died a couple of years ago, such a fine anthropologist, Marshall Salins, who spent most of his career studying those very egalitarian hunting and gathering societies, he said, gifts make friends and friends make gifts. You know, in groups of monkeys, the social cement is grooming. They groom each other to maintain good relationships. With humans, it's exchange of gifts and the little kindnesses we do for each other all the time. That's what creates the social bonds. And so, in an extraordinary way, the crude epidemiological studies where we look at death rates in different groups lead us to some of the fundamentals of our emotional sensitivity. And, you know, whether it's prejudiced against LGBT groups or prejudiced in other groups against other things, or just prejudiced against the poor, looking down on them as inferior and so on, assuming they're poor because they're stupid and lazy, all those kind of attitudes. These anxieties are basically things we share with each other. I hide away my feelings of lack of confidence, my awkwardness that I feel in endless social situations. I hide that away as, you know, it's my little psychological weakness. But no, it's actually something I share with almost everyone. And we've got to get to a point where we recognise that and recognise the damage that our society is doing to us. I'm going to show you just a few graphs. My phone makes a worse noise than that. I chose the cockerel crowing, and so everyone thinks there's a chicken roost.
First thing is it's supposed to be on Saturday.
Anyway, this just shows you some of the other problems that go up with what I've been talking about, these anxieties. This is an index of life expectancy in each country, young people's maths and literacy scores, infant mortality rates, homicide rates, the proportion of the population in prison, teenage birth rates, whether people trust others, obesity rates, mental illness, which in the standard psychiatric classification includes alcohol and drug addiction, and some figures on social mobility. Now, high scores on this graph are bad. So the more unequal countries, USA, Portugal, UK, when we got this data out, doing worse on all those kinds of things than the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Finland, Norway, Sweden, Japan. And actually, it's extraordinary how the Scandinavian, Belgium, Netherlands, Denmark, Finland, all doing much better on all those kind of things. I'm just going to go through these very quickly. Child well-being. This is an index of child well-being that UNICEF put together, 40 different components, including things like whether there's a lot of bullying in schools, whether kids feel they can talk to their parents, what immunisation rates are like, all that kind of thing. And in this graph, lower scores are worse. And so, again, the more unequal countries are doing worse on all that. So, whether you look at the index I've just shown you or this measure of child well-being, more unequal societies do worse for the sort of reasons I've been giving you. Even COVID, they're now, I think I've only got 4 papers here, but there are now about 6 research papers, all peer-reviewed, that show that more unequal societies did worse for a variety of reasons. Even psychologists do experiments with lost wallets. You know, I leave mine here, and basically I see whether it gets returned to me. It's got my address clearly inside it, and they find that only about 20% of wallets come back in the more unequal societies, and in the more equal ones, it's 80%, nearly 80% come back. So huge differences in how helpful people are, standards of honesty. This is the slide I was looking for. This is bullying in different societies. It's the percent of 11-year-olds who bullied others 2 or more times per month. And there's 0 and there's 5%. So 2 or 3% in these countries bullied others, the kids. Whereas in those countries up there, it's more like 20%. So it's almost 10 times as common. And of course, that is hierarchical behaviour. Bullying is about putting people down and saying, I'm better than you. Less social mobility. What's this? Participation. Oh, yes, I want to show you in the next few slides how inequality damages social life. So this is participation in voluntary groups and voluntary organisations. Do people belong to gardening clubs or choirs or whatever locally? All sorts of voluntary groups. And they do in the more equal countries, and yet community life atrophies in the more unequal societies. People trust each other less. All these effects I'm showing you are just the same if you look at the 50 states of America amongst these countries. This is the percent of the population who agree that most people can be trusted. That's about 15%, and that's 60 or 65%. And if you've got to walk home late at night in some city, whether you've got to be aware of who's around you, who else is walking the same way or not, you feel much safer, much more relaxed in a more equal country. I find, I've given a number of talks in Stockholm, and there's something inside you that just relaxes. You don't have to be bothered about that kind of thing. It's strange how you pick it up. This is homicides. There must be 60 studies of homicide in relation to inequality around the world. These are American states, the red dots. Blue triangles are Canadian provinces. And this is homicides per million people. And that would be 15 homicides per million, and you've got about 150, 10 times as common violence. And it's not only violence on the street, it's also domestic violence and so on. If you go to really much more unequal societies than Britain or US, places like Mexico and South Africa, amongst the most unequal in the world, it's gone a stage further. It's not only that they don't trust each other, there's not much community life and more violence, it's that they're frightened of each other. They put bars on their windows and doors and razor wire and so on. And it's not just occasional house, it's street after street. I took that picture when we were giving some lectures. Someone else in our group took that picture, which is South Africa. Very unequal for quite different reasons. This says armed response. So if you're caught climbing in, you might get shot. And you see, this is about people being out for themselves and regarding other people as enemies and a threat. Completely the opposite of good community relationships. And of course, no, I've forgotten the point I was trying to make. That's the trouble with getting older. I always forget one or two sentences as what this is showing is, if you look at the studies of what the determinants of happiness and well-being, you find that crucial is the quality of social relationships. Happiness is whether you're involved in community life, have you got lots of friends and that kind of thing. And I've told you it's also important in health, but what inequality is doing is undermining exactly these key things in our lives together. And interestingly, you can see what it costs. This shows with rising inequality that people spend more on what these two American economists called guard labour. By guard labour they mean security staff, police, prison officers, all the people we use to protect ourselves from each other. These nasty, dangerous people who... So, I could stop there. I've got a few slides, maybe what we can do about it. So I've probably taken on more time than I was given already. If you want to know what we can do about it, you can ask me if we have some questions. Do you want to... Have we got time for some questions? Yeah. And not just questions, but comments, anything you want to say. Yes.
I just wondered, what is the origin then of this inequality? What is, I mean, there's so much information, it's been so interesting, and I read your book that you co-authored, The Spirit Level, was absolutely gobsmacked and shocked by what the stuff in there. So if I kind of missed something in what you've been talking about, I apologise, I've been trying to process it all. What's the origin?
Well, I'll show you. This is in a number of countries, just some perhaps typical rich countries. What happened to inequality? There's 1930, there's 1980, where you see the decline in inequality ceases and the modern rise of inequality starts. And I think this is the strengthening of the labour movement, the social democratic parties, a strengthening of the proportion of the population who think, we can live better than this. Life is going to be qualitatively better for all of us. And then the left, political left, if you like, loses its way, and Margaret Thatcher, Reagan, neoliberalism really takes over there. So it's an ideological change. It's any idea that there's a better way that, the society can work better for all of us, disappearing. So in a way, I think we've got to recreate an enduring political, social movement with a different conception. And I think some of that is central to moving towards sustainability. And I did show you how inequality increases consumerism, which of course is an enormous obstacle to sustainability. There are lots of other ways in which inequality reduces our chance of making the transition to sustainability. And actually what Reagan and Thatcher and other governments did at this point was to lower top tax rates, privatise the utilities, which meant that the bosses who'd accepted more reasonable wages when they were nationalised suddenly started to, and wages suddenly took off. They weakened through legislation the power of trade unions, a whole range of things like that that led to these rises in inequality. I won't. Right, yes.
I'm really interested, and I don't know if it's a comment or a question yet, but thinking about some of the countries that might be outliers, and I'm thinking of those with a smaller socioeconomic difference, but perhaps a more socially conservative. So Japan's a really interesting example where it's performing highly on a lot of your graphs as a country that has good outcomes, but it's also, for example, a country with quite a patriarchal, traditional approach, and how that might impact on LGBT plus people in those countries. And has there been, I'm guessing there's lots of research into those experiences.
Getting the impression you know more about that than I do.
No, well, I'm really interested in it in terms of how, and also thinking about countries, and you were talking about mental health where there are better outcomes, what are the diagnoses, what are the social constructions of mental health, and how we can pick those out to make sure that that the data then is backing up.
Well, I say first that one shouldn't regard services, however important they are, as the main determinants of levels of mental illness any more than doctors are the main determinants of the length of life expectancy. There's just about no relationship. America has more doctors, more hospital beds, than twice as much as any other country on medical care, and it has about the worst life expectancy in the rich world. Because much more important than the care we get once we've got one of these serious diseases is whether and when we get them. I'm not saying medicine doesn't make an important difference. I'm saying that more people will get cancer and heart disease, and they will do worse. The prognosis is worse in the country. But you were asking about Japan. Japan, if there's any country there where the figures are less reliable, it was Japan. We got the figure from the World Bank of Japan's inequality, but there are, first, Japan has been getting much more unequal since we collected that data from the World Bank. And there are currently 3 income surveys in Japan that show slightly different things. So I think Japan doesn't have that enviable position anymore. But early on, when we used to talk about it, I remember somebody saying, who had spent his life studying the Japanese culture and the economy, saying that, talking about pay negotiations, firstly the bosses of the Japanese big companies are more often promoted from within, so they still have loyalties to people low in the hierarchy and so on. And they were saying that in America, during pay negotiations, the knives are out. In Britain, when he was talking about this, which was 20 more years ago, the knives are in the cupboard, but the cupboard's not locked. In Japan, the knives are in the cupboard and the cupboard is locked. And you know this thing about how in big Japanese businesses, the bosses were reputed to wear the same uniform as the workers. They ate in the same canteens, very different from. So something going on there. I remember hearing also that in Greece, well, maybe I don't need Greece as an example, but you know how apparently Greece used to deal with hierarchy. You try and build social alliances with your boss, so you might make him the godfather of your child, or invite him to your wedding. In Japan, apparently, the shop foreman was expected to know not only you, but your family, and was likely to give the main speech at your wedding.
A lot of speeches.
suggesting there's something else going on in the social fabric.
Sorry,
Yes.
just jump in. Very nice piece of information.
Anyone before someone else has a second go? No?
I wanted to ask about environmental degradation. I know that, like on this new series by Attenborough, this is one of the most environmentally degraded countries
Yes.
in Europe. And I know, like, tree cover in certain parts of urban areas of Britain
Yeah.
is fractional, really tiny compared to many other European cities. And we see that division in Sheffield very marked between the green and leafy areas and the ungreen. I just wondered whether that related directly to income inequality, environmental degradation, or is it another factor? She talked about sustainability right at the end as well. I wondered what's going on there and whether you've got something to say about that.
Well, there are relationships. Apparently more equal countries do better in environmental terms. I don't feel I understand quite why, but there are quite a lot of studies suggesting that they do. We put together stuff on recycling of, glass, paper, cans, all the rest of it. A much higher proportion of recycling in more equal countries. What was the other thing? Oh, of course, more people bicycle. Number of little pointers like that.
And that seems
But
to relate to mental health and well-being and more positive outlook on life.
perhaps, but it's also, I suspect, not being so concerned with status. And I don't know, you ride a bike, but it's not very long ago that people driving cars would sort of shout at you as because you're riding a bike, you're clearly inferior.
It's getting worse. In the UK, it's getting worse.
Yeah. So you're right, there is a relationship, but I don't feel I
Thank you.
fully understand it.
I don't want to take up any more time, but it's been really interesting. Are you able to also then maybe factor in social media? I'm just wondering whether it's, I know that's immensely complex, but the part that maybe that plays in reinforce, if it's in a non-human society, it has a greater impact potentially. I don't know, I'm kind
Well,
of guessing.
I think it's maybe a case of whether you're blaming the messenger. And I suspect that people use the media in different ways in more or less equal countries. And when I showed you that graph of bullying,
Yeah.
if there's a lot of bullying, social media is going to be used more for bullying as well.
So it's a tool to kind of
So,
exaggerate something.
Yeah, I think it might heighten these things, but it won't. I'm not sure it would actually cause them. It will just be one more channel that's used to be nasty to each other. I think that's rather an inadequate answer, but sorry, you have.
Well, I just wondered, I mean, because it's relatively recent, isn't it, from 85, that kind of shift. And so why we accepted it? Well, no, I mean,
Let's go around the room now.
that's really, I mean, because that's to do, must be to do with our psychology and it's just, yeah, why? After all those years with egalitarian society, and suddenly it seems like a what?
Well, I suspect that, and Blair was someone who, and when he talked about New Labour, that was giving up on some of the old socialist priorities. And I think it was Mandelson, his main advisor, who said they were extremely relaxed about inequality. But they did have, they gave a lot of importance to reducing child poverty. They were really convinced by the research on the damage that child poverty does. But I think he thought that inequality mattered in the 1930s when so many people were living in such squalor. Then it was wrong for other people to be living in great luxury. But now that, and if you take the poor as the bottom 20%, most of them have the bulk of modern electronics and so on. They have central heating even if they now can't afford to use it. But I think he probably thought of inequality just in material terms. As if the primary relationship was between me and my material circumstances, my house, the goods I've got, and working conditions, not seeing this very powerful psychosocial side, psychological effects of inequality, which is really what I've been working on for a rather long time. When I say I mean there are now so many papers on it, and a lot of the ones I've shown you have been other people's work. Yes.
I just wondered whether you'd be able to comment on, so the idea of like religion, particularly Christianity, in this kind of context, because some of the stuff I've looked at and I'm reading about and educating myself about is the idea of, particularly with LGBTQIA+, there's sort of a societal discomfort with it, which seems to follow the British colonialisation of the world in many places. I just wonder whether, does that have any effect on this? Because that absolutely, in some cases you can see it shifts this bigger divide of social inequality for people LGBTQIA. Do you see what I'm saying now? I'm not sure.
So you started off asking about religion. How does that relate to? Just clarify.
I guess my thinking is, like, does religion have any bearing on this? Because it does in some societies, particularly when people LGBTQIA.
Well, I give you some kind of an answer, but I'm answering as an atheist. I think that belonging to a religious group looks as if it's beneficial to health. There are a number of studies of that. But I think it might be simply because you belong to a social group. Perhaps also feeling that you have an all-powerful friend watching over you, looking after you in some sense. I mean, that could be, it's a very comforting idea. But the societies, America compared to Britain is a much more religious society, although it knows less well. European societies tend to be less religious. And I remember a famous anthropologist, Malinowski, said that we tend to use religion to control the things that are beyond our control. So whether it's praying for whatever it is, or going back in time, doing rain dances, or sacrifices, or whatever, God is treated as important in the areas that we can't control directly. And in a more unequal society, what's the psychologist whether control is, whether people feel in that control of their own destiny or feel just victims of what the world does to them. What is the term?
Internal and external locus of control.
That's right. There's much more sense of external control in more unequal societies. You feel what happens to you is just what the world does to you. A matter of your choices and actions. But, sorry, some of these answers I'm giving are very vague, and as a trained epidemiologist, I like to show people data. Yes.
I was thinking about the practical application for those of us that work with young people and those from the LGBT plus community, and the things that we might do on a practical basis to mitigate for this sense of status inequalities. And so my question is around the sense of belonging and whether a sense of belonging at a local level, say within your community, within the university, within your school, mitigates for the societal imbalance?
And that's what friendship does, and what SAYiT is doing. Trying to create at least a local environment group where you can feel a bit more relaxed, less judged. And it's crucially important. And you're right to talk about that at schools. I haven't seen workplace studies, but I'm sure we'd see the same effect. I wish that there was internationally comparable data on bullying amongst adults. What I showed you, of course, was just kids, because I expect there's more bullying amongst adults in equal societies. I've had much more than my time, and I think you've run out of questions, or patience, or both.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Richard, for coming down. Some really good information there that I'm sure all of us are going to take away with us and appreciate and process a lot of information there, definitely. Really good. But that brings us to the end of today. There's just one more mention that I wanted to mention, and that's this young lad here. Today wouldn't be happening if it weren't for Noah. And I just wanted to say, should we give him a round of applause from his family? His legacy will carry on, and I'm sure his family are going to see this after, because we're actually filming it. So I say thank you to them as well.